The information shared in this podcast and related media is intended to provide broad consumer understanding and knowledge of healthcare topics as they pertain to remote work. All content herein is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Further, this information should not be used in place of a visit, call, consultation, or advice of your physician or other healthcare provider. The owners of this content do not recommend the self-management of health problems. Should you have any healthcare-related questions, please call or see your physician or other healthcare provider promptly. You should never disregard medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen or heard on this podcast or read in related media. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor, seek professional help, or call 911 immediately.
Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast Mental Health Series. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. The purpose of this series is to destigmatize the mental health issues commonly found in the remote work community. We have partnered with doctors, therapists, counselors, and other mental health professionals for a series of in-depth discussions on a broad range of topics, ranging from isolation and depression to crafting meaningful relationships with others, and maybe more importantly, with ourselves. Our guest experts will share their insights in order to arm teams and leaders with the tools they need to thrive now and in the future. Mental health has always been a relevant issue for remote workers, freelancers, and distributed teams. But in today's climate, the subject is becoming more and more pertinent each and every day. I look forward to sharing this valuable information with you, and please join the conversation online, on the socials, or wherever the audience most suited to hear it can get involved. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by TeamMadeApart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free Best Practices Guide. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the show. This week's special guest is Zoe Gillis. Zoe is a mindfulness-based counselor and retreat facilitator who uses group coaching, mindfulness, and immersive wilderness retreats to help individuals and teams move beyond self-doubt, learn to transform challenging emotions, and create the change in the world they wish to see. Here to talk about mindfulness and how we achieve it, resilience, the practice of radical acceptance, self-awareness, and more, please join me in welcoming to the show our special guest, Zoe Gillis. Hey Zoe, how are you? Welcome to the show. I am so glad to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Absolutely. I am too. And, especially given just sort of the world we're living in right now, I think that this different topics of mental health are so, incredibly important right now that, and especially the topics that you discuss, I think this is going to be a really meaningful show for a lot of people. So why don't we, I guess, kind of start at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why we're talking.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a therapist. I have a private practice and I work with creative entrepreneurs. And my whole life has kind of been a zigzag of trying to incorporate all the things that I love into what I do. And so from a really young age, I've always loved adventure and personal growth. My parents divorced when I was really young, and my mom moved me to LA. I was born in New York, and so I grew up kind of bi-coastal and also in a house where there was just like a lot of turmoil and fighting. And so when I was a teenager, I joined a group therapy, and it was life-changing for me. And so then when I went to college, I wanted to combine this love of personal growth and understanding with my sense of adventure. So I actually went and got my degree in outdoor education. And that was really cool because it took me to like all these amazing places in Utah and up in British Columbia. And I started working with youth at risk, doing wilderness therapy. And then I decided that I wanted to work more deeply with people because the kids would come for like a month and we would have these amazing experiences and then they would leave and I wouldn't get to really follow up with them or connect with their families. And so I then went to go get my degree as a therapist. And now I've kind of been trying to weave in like therapy and mindfulness and nature. So before COVID hit, I was doing wilderness retreats. And that was like one of my favorite things to do because I just think there's so much healing power in nature and also in coming together in community and like sitting around a fire. It's so ancient. And so, so that's a little bit about my journey.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, no, I love the meander you rode. And as a creative entrepreneur myself, you know, your story sounds a lot like mine in terms of trying to kind of stick everything you like doing together into this big ball and be able to live the life you want to live. And so I think that's a pretty incredible thing. And the fact that you've been able to sort of pull it off, evolve and change as you grow and you know, as your interests change, I think that's all a really incredible thing. That's, very cool. So that's a great journey. So let's talk a little bit about, I mean, first of all, you mentioned group therapy. I don't know that everybody really knows what that is. Do you mind talking a little bit about what that is or how you engaged with it and why it was so effective for you?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple different pieces in there. I'll start with my own personal experience. So like I said, when I was a teenager, I had an individual therapist and she suggested that I join this group. And the group was between ages like 15 and 30 at the time. So it was a wide age range. And like I said, I grew up in a house where there was a lot of fighting and basically fear and hurt and care often all were expressed in anger. And so that's how I learned also to express, a whole range of emotions. And so I joined this therapy group. And what was so powerful about it for me was to be able to have people offer me feedback about how I was affecting them. So like how when I was hurt, instead of being able to communicate it like that, I would, get really mad or like push them away or act out or pull away and, kind of distance myself. And so to have a group of people tell me what I was doing and do it in a really loving way was so powerful because I think before that point, I didn't really get that somebody could be offering me feedback from a place of love. Like it always felt like it was a personal attack. And so what group helped me do was be able to kind of separate that out and see that people could want to be closer to me and be telling me that from a positive place.
Okay. And maybe I should actually take kind of like half a step back. So you said you started doing group when you were quite young. Like, how did you even know it was a thing? Like, I mean, for example, I mean, there's still kind of a lot of stigma around therapy. Some people don't know when to go or if they should go, or, maybe it feels uncomfortable to go because of, I don't know, the way you were raised or whatever. What gave you sort of the open mind enough to be able to look at therapy as even an option as a young person?
Well, my therapist actually came to give a talk at the school that I was at. And I just basically fell in love with her in that moment. Like she swore and she was, just like really gave me this feeling that it was okay to be wild and like have fears and have anger, but and also be really loving. And so I chased her down and basically begged her to let me come to therapy with her. So I think I kind of, got lucky in that way. And then she suggested the group therapy.
Yeah.
But now, so there's different kinds of groups. To give a little bit more background about just group therapy in general, sometimes there are groups that are around a specific topic. So like an addiction group or, and there's also a difference between support groups versus what are called process groups. So I offer both, but process groups tend to be longer term, and people come and they go weekly. And those groups are really about interpersonal relationships. And the reason they're longer term and we meet weekly and it's the same people is because it takes that time to kind of build the trust and be able to like share your whole self and your deepest, darkest secrets. That trust has to be there. And so process groups are really about learning how to be in relationship even when there's conflict. And so, for people who tend to be more confrontational, it's an opportunity to practice sitting back more, learning how to express themselves differently. And then conversely, for people who tend to be have a harder time speaking up, it's an opportunity to, practice saying how they feel, or if they're hurt, or if something annoys them. And I think there aren't a lot of spaces in our culture where we get to really play with, practice, explore different forms of communication for ourselves, and to try like different behaviors and different ways of communicating something in a safe environment. So.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously for a lot of people, they don't practice this kind of thing a lot, being willing to open themselves up and talk about something or to, expose their fear or their anger or their whatever. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to me that having an opportunity to go practice it in sort of a safe environment would lead to your ability to be able to share more freely with the people you need to, when you're out on your own or in the wild a little bit.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you would talk about those. So you sort of touched on that aspect of group being about interpersonal relationships. I have been thinking a lot lately about sort of the idea of the role of the intrapersonal relationship versus the interpersonal relationship and how much, the two sort of interplay with one another. And so the idea is, or at least my thoughts on the idea are that in order for us to have a successful interpersonal relationship, we need to begin with an intrapersonal relationship that's meaningful. And I think for a lot of people who struggle and, from some of the common ails that tend to be apparent in remote work and, in and around communities that work independently a lot, it's a lot of isolation, it's a lot of depression, it's a lot of these kinds of things that come from sort of being out on your own all the time. And I think what ends up happening is if you don't have a strong relationship with yourself, for example, maybe you don't have the confidence to feel good about your role at work, or you maybe don't feel good about the work you're producing because you're not getting feedback from others. Maybe there's a number of different things there. But so I wondered if you could talk about sort of your take on how important this sort of foundational relationship with yourself is in developing, longer term or more outward relationships with people.
Yeah, I think it's essential. And I know that for me personally, my lifelong journey has so much been connected to how I talk to myself and the relationship that I have with myself. And I guess the cool thing is that it keeps growing. But even like the other day, I caught myself having like a self-critical thought. I had had a conversation with somebody that I didn't know, and afterwards I was feeling self-conscious about what I said. And so, but I could like hear the voice inside kind of being critical, and it was the clearest it's ever been that I saw it, and I was like, oh, that doesn't feel helpful. Like, I don't want to keep having that, I guess, character. Like, sometimes I think of all the different characters that we have, you know, like the judgmental character, the insecure character, or voice,
Sure.
or part of ourselves. And so, I guess I'm getting like a little off track, but I think that that's so important, and being able to develop a relationship with the different parts of ourselves. And I think one of the beginning parts of that is recognition, and to even like acknowledge that there are different parts of ourselves. And I think what helps us do that is just cultivating the part of ourselves that is curious, kind, compassionate, so that when we meet parts of ourselves that are more challenging, we've developed kind of that voice or that way of being with the parts of ourselves that are really difficult.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And there's a couple things that you touched on that I would love to unpack a little bit. The first thing I want to mention that I'm reading a book right now called Radical Acceptance. I think you know it probably. I saw in your background that you had been sort of certified by a group of people in meditation techniques.
Yeah.
With Jack Kornfield and Tara Brach, who's the writer of that book. And I think, some of the things you're talking about, this idea of, hearing these different characters in your mind, and some of the, interplay going on in our heads, I think recognizing it is such a critical aspect of being able to work through it. And, I think sometimes we can easily be pinned down by our negativity and things like that. But by recognizing them, and I think it was in her book, or maybe I've heard this somewhere else, is this joke about sort of, giving it a funny voice or something. Right. So when you've got this negative self-talk going on, you can sort of assign this silly voice to it, like a cartoon character type voice or something to it. Yeah. And so when it's telling you something, really critical or kind of negative or whatever, it just sounds ridiculous. So it's like, how much could I pay attention to this really? And I think that might be kind of an interesting way of thinking about these voices in our head, as sort of, and I like how you put it, sort of as characters. Do you have any thoughts? So this critical inner voice, and I understand that this could be a topic all by itself, but I think a lot of us suffer from that, where, our sort of internal dialogue can become a little bit negative or get a little bit dark. But I think that there's, at least as I understand it, the critical inner voice comes from somewhere. Do you know anything about that? Or can you talk a little bit about just sort of where these negative thoughts come from in the first place?
Yeah. Oh man, I have like so many different thoughts on that. But I think one is if we look at our conditioning, so from family, from society. And then, so that's one, I think, really important piece is, how did the people around us speak to us as we were growing up, and what are the messages that we got from our culture and society around us? And then also there's something called the negativity bias. I think it's Rick Hansen. But he talks about how our brains are literally wired to be like Velcro for the negative and Teflon for the positive. And so, and that actually this was, for our survival, so that when we were out on the savannah, like we were paying attention to what could be dangerous and how to protect ourselves and how to evolve and become better. And so I think that, is also a really important piece, that to recognize that often the negative voices, they're there in a lot of ways to try to protect us. And that was something kind of like interesting. I remember when a teacher of mine told me that, I was like, oh yeah, it's so obvious, but it just clicked in a different way, which is that the voice that's really loving and positive is there to nurture and motivate me to become better, but so is the critical voice. And so their intention actually is both to try to either keep me safe or protect me or motivate me, but that the way that they go about it is different and therefore ends up having different effects. And I think the critical one tends to leave us feeling more defeated and, spiraling downward.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really cool way of putting that, actually, because I know even in my own head, as I'm talking about this and asking you to describe negative inner voices and things like this, like in my own head, I'm thinking of this dark connotation, right? This is some deep, dark seated something that's affecting us negatively. I hadn't thought to frame it that way. And I know that some, or at least in the little bit of research I've done, I know that sometimes that can come from parents, other things like that. So there are definitely external sources that could be providing this negative voice. But I love the idea of framing it as that they're actually there to protect you. I think that's pretty enlightening, actually.
Yeah, and something kind of going off of what you just said, because one of the things that my teachers pointed out in that moment, which I thought was really useful, is like, we also have to become wise about distinguishing like whether it is there to protect us, because I think most of the time it is, but sometimes like if it's a voice that's been internalized, for example, from someone who is an abuser, then that's actually not there to protect us. Like, and so to be able to begin to pay attention to that part, but because I think in that case, then it's helpful to not really give it too much space, that voice.
Yeah.
But if it is there to protect us, then I think it's like becoming curious and building a relationship with like, okay, like what is this message that's trying to be told to me?
Yeah. Well, and I think too that so much of this is another topic that I've spent some time thinking about recently, which is pattern recognition. Trying to understand the way the negative voice is talking to you. And this particular example might be an example of this pattern recognition, where you can understand the difference in how this negative voice is speaking to you. I think, and I'll butcher this, but there was some book I read, I think it's actually called Critical Inner Voice, and it's got some exercises in there, but it basically says, you're supposed to sort of tweak the phrase or whatever it is that you're saying to yourself negatively, but put it in the frame of like, as if you were saying it to yourself. And for some reason, doing it in that way or sort of flipping it around in that way will sort of uncover who it was that said it to you sometimes. Like it could sort of reveal that, oh, that's how mom used to say this to me, or that's how, and so it really helps you understand that. And I think that by recognizing, developing this ability to recognize patterns in the way that you're talking to yourself, I think it could prove really useful in trying to tell the difference between which negative voice you're talking to, the builder up or the tearer down.
Yeah. And then I think there's also the aspect of bringing it into the body, like our sensations of how, like I know that when I have started to become more and more aware of like when I talk to myself a certain way, how that starts to make me feel physically, like I feel smaller, my chest tightens, I just can feel my shoulders like shrug in. And so I think also beginning to have a relationship between like not only our thoughts, but also like our bodies and our hearts and our breath and all of those things that become affected too.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so to sort of circle back around to this idea of intrapersonal relationships that sort of teed off this whole thing, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of self-care and self-compassion. So, and this idea of, the things that we need to be doing for ourselves. And I think this foundational conversation we've had about inner voices and things like that will really contribute to this bit of the conversation. But I think discussion about, what we should be doing for ourselves and in terms of self-care, self-compassion, but also as that pertains to resilience. So this is one of the topics that I think is really critical for people right now, especially during COVID and all these other things. It's really difficult to sort of get beat down and then get into a bad spot and just sort of feel bad about it. And maybe ultimately there's just not a lot we can do about it. It's crazy, unprecedented times, right? But I think that by developing some resilience through developing, confidence and self-reliance and some of these other things, I think we may be able to better combat situations like this and hopefully, less massive global problems in the future. So do you mind talking a little bit about just sort of resilience as it pertains to self-care and sort of building this fundamental relationship with ourselves?
Yeah, sure. Can I ask you first, just for you, like how do you define resilience?
For me, and maybe it has to do with my age, I just turned 40 and, I don't come from, I'm not that World War II generation. So I'm not like the absolute suck it all up kind of guy, but I'm somewhere in between that and totally, everybody else should be looking out for me. So I sort of characterize my, my place just as being a little bit suck it up, a little bit work through it, a little bit, boys don't cry. a little bit of, all these kinds of things that are sort of probably pretty stereotypical of my age group. I think there was a lot of pride in older generations on really working hard and trudging through stuff. So it was kind of this idea of, instead of using the, snow plow, you're using the snow shovel, you're pushing snow uphill, but for the sake of it, just so that you can say that you worked harder than everybody else. Yeah. And so I think there was a little bit of that. I also think it comes a little bit from my background in creative as a lifelong art director, creative director. I've spent a lot of time in and around agencies and have run my own, and the culture there really rewards the guy who worked overnight, or the guy who, killed himself and worked a 20-hour shift to get a project done. There's a lot of that kind of stuff in the culture around agencies, and it's changing, but I think that's kind of where I live, is sort of in this, I will bust my butt for you and I will work overnight, sort of sometimes even to my own detriment.
And that feels like resilience, like to be able to do that?
I think the resilience is to be able to bounce back and do it again part. Yeah. And so I think that's where I see that going. And so having all those feelings, yes, I just worked 24 hours. Yes, I knocked it out. And by God, you can count on me to do it again. That's kind of it. Even though I think in the long run, I can be at least logical and recognize it's not good for me to work that kind of time. I can recognize all these things. Yeah. But at the same time, when you're wrapped up in it, that's what it feels like. And so for me, I guess that resilience is that ability to sort of push through hard things and then circle back and do it again.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting because, that's definitely how the last bit of how you defined it, like to be able to meet a challenge and in the face of that challenge, kind of like back up or bounce back and stay connected to yourself. But I can see when you were talking about it, I was like, oh, but the self-care piece. Yeah.
Right. Well, and it's funny because for the lion's share of my career, for my entire 20s, basically, I was working, 15 to 16 hours a day by myself in an office, head down by myself all the time. And honestly, as a younger creative then, that's when I started experiencing these problems with isolation and depression and things like that. I was working myself to death. I was working with clients almost exclusively over the internet. And so I wasn't seeing people. I wasn't having meetings. I was just sitting in my office all day working. The only saving grace is by then I was married. And so I got to go home to a family. But, and so I think that sort of gave me a little bit of pause. But, ultimately during that 10-year span, most of my relationships sort of petered off. Most of my friends ran off and got married or went to college or whatever, started careers. And so I became very isolated. Even though I had this nice home base, I was very isolated from sort of friends and personal relationships. And it actually wasn't until some years later, after we moved down to Utah, I came down here to work for an ad agency. Basically, they had hired me away from my private practice, but I continued doing my work almost like as a safety net. So if the thing at the agency didn't work out, I still had my thing to fall back on. But what that led into was 5 years of working 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. for the agencies and 7 p.m. to 2 a.m. for my company.
Oh my gosh. And
so I did that for 5 years, and I was home a lot and I was around a lot, but I didn't come to bed when people went to bed. I didn't, I'd stop and eat, but that was kind of it, and, I'd sit on my laptop while we watched a movie or whatever, but it was very disconnected for a long time. Yeah. And it actually wasn't until in that same period I met the girl who's actually now sort of my partner over in Barcelona. And after visiting her in Spain for the first time and seeing the way Spanish culture treats humans and treats relationships and all that stuff, it was a real paradigm shift for me. There are a lot of people that sort of look at Spain and go, oh, the party, or oh, the food, or oh, the whatever. But for me, I was really taken aback by how quickly I was brought into like her social groups and her familial groups, even though at the time I spoke no Spanish. And, and for me, I don't know why, but for whatever, it was the right moment. It was the right thing. It was the right whatever. And it put me on a totally different track. Oh, wow. And it shifted my whole paradigm from this sort of self-centered, approach where I was killing myself doing all this work under the guise of doing this work for my family. Like I was trying to provide, and be a good provider, but ultimately it's a little bit selfish, right? Because I was spending all this time, trying to achieve this end of making more money or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then after coming back from Spain, I was sort of changed, and I spent really, I mean, even up to now, I've spent a lot of years working on how to integrate this ethic of the importance of humans in our lives, and just how important interpersonal relationships are. And so, and actually, a really long story will get us to where this podcast was born, was sort of, part of all that.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's sort of where it comes from anyway. Yeah. So sorry for the super long tangent.
No, I was thinking, like, one of the things that you touched on, which I find really interesting too, is these other aspects of resilience that you're kind of pointing to, which is that the sustainability, right? So like, you may be resilient in a moment, but is that like able to bounce back, but is it sustainable in a way where like your whole being is taken into account? And then the other thing that you kind of were saying at the end, that this idea of like, as an individual, how resilient can we be if the culture or the people who we're around are not included in that? And I think that's like really relevant to what's going on right now with Black Lives Matter. Like, like in terms of being resilient on our own versus like as a nation and collectively, like what does it mean to actually like be resilient and make sure that everybody is taken care of, and like the whole health. I don't fully have that thought like formulated, but it just reminded me of
No, I think you're right, because as we're talking, and maybe it's because you put me on the spot and made me tell you my definition of resilience. But the other aspect of resilience that I think of a lot is, it's still bouncing back, but it's a little different. It's more this ability to kind of weather a storm, right? And sort of not get yourself all wrapped up in sort of the dumps or whatever. And so it has less to do maybe with this physical energy, the ability to plow the field and then come back and plow it again tomorrow. But it's more to do with this, crap's happening, and there's a lot of things I can't control right now, but I can control what's going on inside.
Yes.
And so, and that gives me the opportunity to be resilient in that sense.
Yeah. And so like one of the things that I think is really helpful with resilience is this idea of being able to not take things personally. And when I say that, like I remember when I first heard, so in mindfulness and Buddhism, they talk about like the 3 marks of existence, that nothing's permanent. So I always think of it as the 3 Ps: nothing's permanent, nothing's perfect, and nothing's personal. And the personal part, I was always kind of like, oh, I don't know, because like things, but what I take that to mean now is that like it's not just about us, like we are part of a larger collective. And so like, even for example, going back to what we were talking about in the beginning, that, the fact that I had learned how to express things in anger in my family, like, yes, that was personal to me, but also like, it's not personal. Like that was a whole like lineage of trauma that happened in my family and got passed down. And so that in that way, it's not personal. And so I think like with resilience, it's like being able to be in a storm and go like, okay, like these are the things that I have control over, and this is what I don't have control over. And how can I relate to what's happening in a way that's going to be helpful?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And it's one of the things that I sort of credit to the agency business, despite all the sort of the negative things. One of the more positive things that happens in a creative agency, for example, is this act of critique, right? So you've done some work and you take it in front of a group of people, and this group of people are going to tear it to shreds. And what it does is allows you to sort of separate yourself from the work you did, and allow you to have some people look at it objectively and give you feedback in one way or another. Generally speaking, people will try and be kind. They're not just trying to hurt you for the sake of hurting you. But, after years and years and years of doing this, you become pretty darn good at taking feedback, taking criticism, and you can sort of keep that external, right? They're not attacking me as a human. They're saying, oh, well, you could have done this better. Maybe your lighting could have been better, or maybe you could have done this or that better, but it's all from a good place, right? It's this idea of how do we make things better for people. So I really like that idea, especially of your 3 Ps, this one about not taking things personally. I think there's also a real aspect in society where we think people spend a lot of time thinking about us. And all the bad things they're doing to us, and how dare they, society, whoever, do this or that to me, when the reality is most people are pretty caught up in their own business and they're not really paying that much attention to you. So I think that that's a great thing to think about, is sort of this idea of not taking things too personally.
It's also like, that's one of the things that I think group is so great about, is being able to, like feel really like maybe triggered is one word, or like activated, and still like be able to hear what other people are saying and take feedback and kind of practice that interplay of like taking care of yourself, but also hearing the other person. And I also think like, I think right now, just to kind of bring it to what's happening in our world collectively at the moment, like, as a white person, I also think it's super important in this moment of time for me to be able to like hear feedback, like look at like my part in this larger whole, because I know like for a lot of my clients, like one of the things that's coming up is like feeling, like they're not doing enough, or like there's something wrong with them and they're horribly wrong, and like feeling so guilty and so awful. And I think it's really important to be able to like hold the pain of like, maybe if we've hurt someone or made a mistake, to be able to hold that with enough strength to not collapse.
Yeah. Well, and I think especially right now, it's kind of stuff upon stuff, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's, we've all been struggling for months now with isolation and things as a result of COVID. And then, for the brief weekend that everybody's back out, protesting and all this stuff, it seems to be piling on.
Yeah.
And so,
so
and
much.
then, and it's fueled by negativity in the media and negativity, all over in the social channels and all this stuff. And so it's really easy to, fall victim to overwhelm and things like that. And so I think it is great to maybe, figure out how to navigate that in a healthy way. Yeah. And so maybe this is a good segue into the idea of mindfulness and spending some time talking about that. I think it's one of these words that kind of gets bandied around a little bit. I think it's, kind of everywhere. And depending on which camp you're in, it's either super hippy dippy or it just means to be thoughtful and introspective. So I think there's a lot of range in mindfulness, but I wonder if you talk a little bit about what it means to you and sort of how people can implement mindfulness practices into their day-to-day to maybe work through problems like what's going on today.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Well, I think mindfulness, so the really common definition that's used is John Kabat-Zinn's definition, which is paying attention on purpose, moment to moment, non-judgmentally. And so I think there's two important components of mindfulness. There's the act of paying attention to what's happening in the moment. And then there's also the quality of attention that we're bringing, because we could be paying attention to something, but, like hating it or being really judgmental. And so I think both pieces are really important to pay attention to.
Okay. Yeah. So I think you're right. And I think it does go back a little bit to what we were talking about, sort of self-care and self-compassion. It's this idea of being purposeful in the attention that we're paying for different things. And intention is one of these words I throw around a lot, but it's sort of this idea of, doing things on purpose. Yeah. So I really like that as part of this sort of, exploration of mindfulness. I think another aspect of mindfulness that people get into, and maybe this is more the practice of it versus just the idea of it, is these ideas of, meditation or breathing and different things like this, different techniques people can use to, lower stress levels or sort of center their focus maybe before they start work or whatever. Do you have any advice on that kind of stuff? I know you have a background in meditation and some things like that. Do you mind talking about that a little bit? Yeah.
So, I think one of the things is the difference between formal practice and informal practice. And so formal practice is, really kind of meditation and what people would imagine as that, like sitting in a position and either closing your eyes or kind of turning inwards with the intention to pay attention to our thoughts and our feelings. And then informal is a little bit more along the lines, I think, of mindfulness, which is, bringing that practice from meditation out into our daily lives. And yeah, I lost my train of thought a little bit. Will you remind me what you?
Yeah, no, I was just asking sort of, first of all about meditation as a possible option for people to use as a technique to try and work through different stressors and things like that. But also just, sort of the, difference in the types of, I guess, one of the things that's come up more than once is I've had people tell me that, meditation, things like this are things they can't get into because it feels like a time commitment, right? We're already really busy. It feels like one more thing on the list. It's like, hey, how do we do that, right? And I had somebody talk to me about therapy this way. And I don't know if it applies to meditation, so you'll have to fill me in. But they sort of gave me the suggestion that with therapy, it also doesn't have to be this 3 times a week lifetime commitment to therapy.
Yeah.
Maybe you need that, maybe you don't, but when you do need it, you should be able to call on it. And when you don't, you shouldn't.
Yeah.
And so the idea, and it's funny because it's just a little bit nuanced, but for me, it was a different take than I'd ever heard, was this idea that, not having to commit to a lifetime of therapy, rather just being able to use it when you need it. I thought was sort of an innovative approach or a different approach. And I wonder if meditation is kind of that way too. Because I know, like I've had a couple, at least one, but maybe a couple like really good meditation experiences in my life where I went, holy crap, that's awesome. This is the thing. And then I've spent the rest of my life chasing that dragon and never getting there. And so, so I don't know what was right about that time and wrong about the rest or, whatever. But I wonder, can you just sort of, apply meditation as needed? When things are getting stressful, can you just stop and breathe? Or do you need to actually develop a practice of meditation?
Yeah, I mean, so I wish I could be a little bit more concrete in this, but I think it's like whatever fits for you. I think absolutely anybody can drop into it at any, you're having a stressful moment, you connect to your breath and that offers some relief for that moment. That's huge. That's like a moment where like in the midst of kind of internal chaos, you're able to like stop and take a beat. I think that's awesome. And I think there's a whole world of that can be explored internally of our minds and our, bodies and emotions and the interplay between our internal world and external world that can happen through meditation. And so I think it's like anything else, the amount of time that you put into it it's also like one of those things, like, if you try to, so I was a gymnast for a while and, in the beginning, I was like, oh my God, like I conquered, I was really young, but I conquered like a cartwheel, but it can go so far, like by the end I was doing cartwheels with no hands on the balance beam. So like, do you know what I'm trying to say? Yeah. Like in the beginning, you don't even know what you don't know. But there's so many things I think that can be pathways into knowing ourselves better. So my pathway has been through therapy and through meditation, but I absolutely think that people can find pathways in other ways, whether it's through dialogue or journaling or, jujitsu or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a, reticence towards meditation or mindfulness in general, as it feels like a little hippie-like or something. And I think it's this idea that, in order to meditate, you must do a thing, right? You have to go to meditation camp. You have to learn how to do meditation. It's this whole thing. And I think so for that reason, I think a lot of people stay out of it or don't use it because they don't feel like they're doing it the right way or whatever. So to your point about practice, it feels like you could begin and then, mature, right? So you can become better. But it seems like doing anything, stopping and intentionally taking a breath or anything and calming down might sort of fall under the, under the definition of meditation.
Yeah, I also think there's a huge misperception out there that meditation is to stop thinking, to like clear your mind. And actually that isn't really possible. Like our minds are designed to create thoughts and images. And so Jack Kornfield actually often says our minds secrete thoughts like our mouths secrete saliva. It just kind of like happens. And so that actually the practice is not to get rid of thoughts, but to become familiar with what our thoughts are and to be able to see them and decide whether we're going to kind of follow that thought and jump on the train, or just kind of let that thought arise and then pass away. And so, yeah, a lot of people say that to me, like, oh, I can't meditate because like I just sit down and I start thinking all the time. And it's like, oh, well, then you're doing it perfect.
Well, and I think that's it, right? I mean, back to our ideas of resilience and self-care, self-compassion, all this thing, so much of it is deciding what to do with those thoughts when they pop into your head.
Yeah.
And I think it was Bruce Lee that said, be like water, be this idea that you're sort of freely flowing and, going in and out of thought and things like that, but you don't necessarily have to stop and hang. And, I know for me in my personal bit, I have a hard time not stopping and hanging on thoughts or catching a thought and then just riding that wave and going nuts and going down that tangent. And, for good or for bad, it's not always a negative thing, but, like that's just sort of the way my mind works.
I think it's the way all of our minds works. And that's why that's the practice, right? Like, because it is really kind of like a muscle.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense, right? I mean, how could you expect to have it all figured out from the first go,
Yeah.
So.
Well, and even, I've been meditating, I'd say consistently now for 2 years, but off and on for maybe 10. And I have some days where I sit and I'm like, oh my gosh, like my mind is going crazy. And so I think, it's learning to even just notice, like, and be with the different states that as humans we all experience, like agitation or dullness or tiredness or boredom. It's like, it's less to try to control those states and more about becoming familiar with them. Like, what are the qualities? What do the, like, I remember I had this time once where I was meditating and the garbage truck, like, dropped something outside, or there was a loud bang and it scared me. And so my whole nervous system kind of like jumped, and I was so peaceful before that. And then I watched as my mind went to like all these fears about like the future and my job. And, and I was like, whoa, that physical fear sensation just triggered all of this thought loops. So it's like, it's just to have those moments of seeing what happens.
Well, yeah. And I think what I like about that little anecdote, by the way, is this idea that, life still happens. Like, even if you're trying to meditate, like life can happen. Right. And so, yes, you might get interrupted, or yes, your kid might come busting in, or yes, a coworker might, throw a stapler over the wall, or who knows. But whatever it is, it's okay, I guess is the thing. And so back to this idea.
That's the point, actually.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess maybe that's the idea of going back to, your definition of mindfulness, this idea of paying attention on purpose without judgment.
Yes.
Is this idea that life can happen, but, in your practice, like, you don't need to judge it. It just is. Yeah. Life just happened, and that's that, Yeah. And so, and I think your awareness or the practice you've been doing is what allowed you to sort of recognize, oh, look how I've been triggered, and look how these things have steered my thought patterns. And I think that that's something we could all sort of work towards, back, circling back again to this idea of resilience and how we can, maybe become more capable of weathering these storms, weathering the dumpster being dropped out back, or, the next pandemic, whatever it happens to be. I think this idea of building that sort of ability to be, I guess, kind of even keeled, to be able to handle stuff as it comes in and out, because you have sort of this mental fortitude that you're allowed to, sort of recognize. You don't need to get all up in arms, just understand life just happened, and now you need to react maybe, or you don't, but now you can assess.
Yeah.
And so, so I think that's really great. One of the things though, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say too, like so the way that I came to meditation is I was going through a breakup, and I was so sad. Like, I went through a lot of shit as a teenager, but going through that breakup was like the most depressed. I had no personality. I was like, and so I was like looking for anything to make me feel better. And I started listening to Ram Dass and Eckhart Tolle, and it offered me relief. And so I went down that path because I was following what was helping. Like, it made me feel better. So it wasn't a should or something that, like, I feel like today one of the kind of difficult things with meditation is it becomes like a should. And so then at least for me, I sometimes get rebellious against the things that I'm supposed to do. So, so I think it's also important to follow like what what offers relief? Like what
Yeah,
feels
no,
like,
I think that's a nice perspective too, because I think you're right. I think, back to sort of the joke I was making about mindfulness being a little hippy dippy or whatever. Like, I think that there's things like this, like meditation, like therapy, like whatever, that come and go in waves, right? Like all of a sudden it's the popular thing. So everybody's going to therapy and everybody's doing this or that. And, and not that it isn't fine, or maybe it's great for everybody to do that. But this idea that now it's the thing we should do for whatever reason, regardless of what our situation is or what we think or what relief we need or whatever. And so I think it's really insightful to think about it that way, and that, we should be sort of chasing down what we want, and I think that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast by talking to such a broad swath of experts, is that we're getting sort of a really round picture of many of the things that we might do to overcome a number of issues that are really common in remote work, for example.
yeah.
And, but I think greater than remote work, even, I think so many of these problems are just human problems, people.
Yes.
And so I think it's really good advice. And I think that this idea of chasing something down just, to keep up with the Joneses, or, do whatever your friend's doing, or, you want to be as cool as the lady down the block, and she's doing it, so it must be great.
Or because your therapist told you to also, like, I'm like,
yeah, it's true. And so I think that that's a really good observation. So, and again, maybe that circles back to these ideas of being self-aware and understanding who we are and where we are, and recognizing our needs. I know that for me in particular, like if you asked me to articulate my needs, I would have a really hard time doing it. I might be able to feel them day to day, or sometimes I'll recognize them or be more cognizant than others. But I think generally speaking, I would have a really hard time articulating what it is that I need. And so I sometimes have a proclivity to fall into that should camp, like go do something because I should. And so I understand that people might struggle with that a little bit, but I think that your experience is a nice insight. So the next thing I wanted to kind of cover real quick, as we're starting to get to the end here, one of the big things that I think is maybe the core of all of these things, or maybe the fruit of it, is this idea of basically being able to relinquish control and to trust. In the remote work world, as just one example, trust is critical, because basically you don't have employees on site. You can't stand over your shoulders and look at them. And for a lot of managers, this leaves people struggling, like with trust and their inability to, really watch you and check on it. But that trust is often sort of misplaced motivation, because what they're actually worried about is hitting quarterly numbers or keeping their job or whatever. But it's manifesting itself as, I need to micromanage all these people. But as it pertains to just us and people, I think so much of what's going on, our fear, our things like this, are our ability or lack thereof to control our environment or what's going on. And I think this idea of being able to develop trust, and especially maybe in the context of relationships, with our coworkers, with ourselves, with everybody, we're basically agreeing to forfeit a little bit of control and put a little bit of faith or a little bit of trust in people. And so I wonder if you couldn't sort of talk about that as a topic, just this idea of developing trust, maybe intrapersonally at first and then interpersonally. And then so sort of how we can maybe overcome fear by developing trust.
Yeah, I think it definitely touches on a lot of what we've talked about, because I think so much of it starts with developing that relationship with ourselves. So trusting that whatever comes up, like that we can handle it, and that we will be able to make wise decisions, or, weather the storm. And then I think that translates out to the people in our relationships, because it makes setbacks or challenges, or maybe not meeting the mark, I think so much less scary. It's I think when there's trust, we're able to see those challenges as opportunities, as opposed to like failures, for example, opportunities for growth. And I think also, trust is such a broad thing. Like, as you were talking, I was thinking like, okay, well, I think the question I would ask myself is like, what is it that I need to trust? Or what is it that if I trusted, like, what would I get from that? Yeah.
I think that that makes sense, right? Because I mean, I guess trusting for the sake of trusting doesn't make a
Right.
lot of difference. But
Right.
but you do need to be able to rely on your coworkers or your employer or whatever. And so there does need to be some level of trust. It doesn't mean that you're, revealing intimate secrets or anything with these people. Maybe you have a level that you maintain at work and a level that you maintain in a social circle or whatever. But I think it's all sort of that, right? And so it's this idea of sort of maybe relinquishing control a little bit and relying on
Yeah.
other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that to me, when I hear it, that sounds more accurate. It's like relinquishing control. And that, of course, relinquishing control is going to bring up fears. And so then it's like, okay, well, what's the fear? Like, what is the actual fear? And then how do I address that fear within myself? So, like, because it's going to be different if the fear is like, well, this person actually hasn't done the task like multiple times. So I'm afraid that if I pull back, they're not going to do it. Like, that is going to require a different action than like they have time and time again done their work. And, but I'm just afraid that something's going to go wrong. And so then I think it's like that internal thing of going like, okay, well, like, what do I need to be able to look back and go like, well, actually, there's a lot of proof that things are going to go right. And so, maybe what I need in that moment or what the person needs in that moment is reassurance or like a reality check.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where having a relationship with yourself, where you're checking in and really able to ask yourself the questions to pay attention to like, what's the fear? And once you know what the fear is, what do you need around that fear to surrender or let go a little bit more?
Yeah, no, I like that. I think that's a nice approach. As we're getting right here to the end, I wanted to touch on just one more thing. And of course, now you mentioned at the top that, during COVID, we're doing less of these, but it's this idea of these retreats. And, I think, we had talked one time prior to doing this interview and I could tell that, I mean, you're obviously very excited about the outdoors, but you're also really into the outdoors as it pertains to sort of overall mental health and sort of the value that you think is sort of extracted from that. I know in the remote work community specifically, these guys, even though most of the time they're working apart and they're, not often in the same office, generally speaking, they will try to put together, annual retreats and things like that. And, they're maybe not always up in the woods, sometimes at a hotel somewhere or whatever. But I wanted to talk to you just sort of briefly about the value of a retreat, sort of in the sense of, this is time to go foster relationships, really, solidify things that we're thinking or not thinking, and sort of just what you think sort of the, I guess, overall or overarching value of doing these retreats is.
Yeah. Oh, I think there's so much value. I mean, I think first of all, there's something about being in nature that, especially, it's so vast. And so when we're surrounded by a giant star-filled sky or huge mountains or an open desert, I think, there's this sense that the container, like that nature, can hold whatever we're bringing. And then on top of that, there's the lack of overstimulation. And so during daily life, there's, emails coming in, there's responding to other people's demands. But when you go out into nature, there's this putting down of everything, all the pressures of day-to-day life. And I think creating that physical space gives us the opportunity to look inward and just hear our thoughts in a different way.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think, for a lot of people, it's really important to get away sometimes, especially if you live in one of these really urban areas and you honestly just can't escape it. You mentioned being out in Los Angeles area. I mean, if you're downtown, there is no escape from, there is no nature outside of the coyotes living down there now.
Yeah.
But outside of that, it's really difficult to get out. I know from my own experience, my family has a small cabin on a lake in Idaho. And I know for me, even though now, nowadays we can get cell phone service and things like that out there, our inclination to sort of just step away, right? To sort of put our phones down and go just play out in the lake or do whatever, right? Get away from it. And I know that those moments for me are really impactful in terms of just giving my brain time to sort of settle down. And I'm one of these infinitely connected guys, always on the phone, always on the computer, always doing whatever. And, it's the way I make my living is by being online all day. And so it's really critical, I think, to get this opportunity to sort of step out. And I think it circles back and maybe puts a nice little bow on this conversation, and that getting out and spending this time with yourself and others really allows you to sort of, I guess, take the time or find the space to think about yourself enough to start developing the care and compassion you need to sort of keep things together.
Yeah. And it's with intention too, which is like something we were talking about, right? Like, I think there's something so healing about going into nature no matter what. But I think when there's intention set around it, like the intention to either self-reflect around something or connect with others, that there's just something really magical that can happen in that.
Yeah. So in closing, I want to ask you one more question, and it's a little out of left field, but I'm trying to ask everyone. I just forgot until the end.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I'm kind of playing around with, at least now in the remote work space, is trying to understand the role of the employer in our mental health space versus our own role and our own responsibility in the mental health space. So I just wanted to ask you in closing, what is one thing that as an employer that I could do to make impactful change in the way that we treat or handle the mental health of our distributed teams, our remote workers? And then what is one thing that I as a remote worker should be doing or can do to take care of my own mental health needs?
I think that as an employer, I think having really explicit conversations with employees around kind of what we were talking about in the beginning, like feedback, creating space for there to be feedback, and intentional ways that both parties can hear that feedback, and that it's a two-way street, that employers are listening to what their employees are saying. Like, for example, I know right now, like a lot of issues that are coming up around, whether people are wearing masks in the workplace, for example, and what kind of fear that creates. And I think one of the things that I see I tend to work more with the employee side, but is this sense that there's like not even room to say if people, if they're feeling unsafe. And so then I think that, doesn't create a great work environment.
Sure.
And then I think for employees working at home, I think being intentional around time. So I think it's so easy because the boundaries, like all the boundaries are gone, right? Like there's not you're not clocking in, clocking out. You're not driving to work. You're not in a space that's contained. And so I think creating boundaries, whether it's around time, around your space, so that there are transitions and recognitions of transitions, like this is me starting and this is me stopping, or this is like when I come into this space, this is what I'm doing. I think that's like really important and easy to kind of slip out of, to not do.
It's true. Yeah, that's a great example. And rings especially true to me. That's my whole thing. I have a very, the same routine every morning, same breakfast every morning, same everything every morning, because that is the routine I've built to start my day. Yeah. And I know, just from lots of conversations with remote workers and digital nomads in every way, shape, and form that people are working isolated. There's a lot of range in what routine means or what, boundaries mean. But, back to my story about spending my whole 20s nose down working all day and night, like that was me with no boundaries, right? And even now I struggle a little bit, but I've come a long way. And I can kind of recognize the difference. And so I think that that's a really critical factor. So thanks for that. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, Zoe, just to sort of wrap things up, where can people learn more about you and your practice, you in general, and how they might connect with you if they have any questions or comments or anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best place to connect with me is on Instagram, and my handle is Zoe Gillis MFT. And then you can also check me out on my website, which is zoegillis.com. But yeah, that Instagram's a great way to DM me, or I would love to connect, and always like to hear what people are up to.
Yeah, that's great. Well, yeah, and we'll make sure to include links to all that stuff in the show notes so that people can track you down.
Awesome.
So cool. Well, thank you so much, Zoe. I really appreciate your time. This was awesome. And I'm really grateful for having the opportunity to sit and visit with you about this stuff.
Me
It's
too.
really,
Thank you.
really great stuff.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know you anything.